Hello, hello, hello. This is Lindy from Lindy's Magpie Reads.
And I'm Shawn, the book maniac. Hello.
Shawn and I had a reading project, and this is how it started. On December the 8th, I fell while I was curling and banged my head, broke my wrist, and I had a concussion, and I wasn't able to read. It's a fate that is just tragic for somebody who reads all the time. And Shawn very kindly offered to read aloud to me. And every day he chose a short story, and he also read from a novel over Voxer that I could listen to at my convenience. There's a big time difference for us since I'm in Edmonton in Canada and Shawn's in Tokyo, but Voxer works great. So then after each story, we would have a chance to talk about the reading too. And that went on for 23 days, right, Shawn?
I did. I just asked Siri to count up the days between December, what did I say, 17th? I forget what the start date was, but it was 23 days from about mid-December to early January. Yeah. It was one of the most memorable reading experiences of my life, I would say. So it was not an app. For me, it was not very soon into the project. It had almost nothing to do with me being doing something for you. I was doing something for myself that was so incredibly exhilarating, because what I was doing was I was pulling ebooks off my Kindle or whatever and books off my shelf that I had never read, and I sampled so many. Be interesting to have a count of those, and I didn't do that, but and so many of those I now am dying to read, that it was just this kind of bibliomaniacal get acquainted exercise with me from my library. I just loved it so much, and it was a real bonding experience between us. So it's just I just really want to commemorate it and share some of the books and stories that we both each loved. But I also want to commemorate it as something that I think the world needs more of. You don't need to have a friend with a concussion to do this. You could just do this with any bookish friend. And because it was transformatively exhilarating for me in terms of how I see the books that I'm surrounded by. There's so many of them now that are not just batting eyes at me, but they're just really beckoning to me.
You hear the heart beating, eh?
Yes, exactly. So it was just an absolute delight. And just to add a little bit to Lindy's introduction, I think it started with just one book a day, and and always a short story. And then I started adding novels. And by the end, because we had to have a cutoff date because I had to go back to work and blah, blah, blah. So as January 9th loomed, I just kept adding more to each day's reading. I think by the end, I was reading for a full hour, if not 90 minutes, from 4 different books each day, because it was just didn't want it to ever end. So yeah, it was fantastic. Tell people who don't know you, how are you doing now?
I am doing pretty well. So this is about 3 months on when we're recording this.
That's right. We're recording this on February 26th. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And I still have symptoms that are interfering with my vision. I've got multiple vision and double vision, both. But I've been doing vision therapy, and it's really helping me to read. So I'm reading larger print and graphic novels and lots of audiobooks. And I'm more and more able to read for longer periods of time on my own with regular print as well. So
that is awesome. That's great. So you don't need me anymore. Can I still do it sometimes, even if you don't need it for any medicine, health reasons?
Of course.
Yes, I think we need to make it an annual event, even just a certain long, the Queen Victoria's birthday weekend or something. Just do it. Lindy and I are each going to be sharing 5 of our top stories or novels that were sampled or read in their entirety during this reading project. And boy, it was agonizing to pull only 5, right?
It sure was. Yeah.
And for a variety of reasons, most to do with me and my messy life, we have had to put this off and put it off. So there's quite a bit of distance from, mid-December and even to early January to when we're recording this. We've both done a certain amount of reviewing to freshen our perspective on our texts, but there will be some of these that we're very enthusiastic about that we don't have a whole lot to say because so much time has gone by. And also that I am going to have a full list, alphabetical by author, of all of the books that I shared with Lindy. And it's too long to fit into the show notes because, what is it, a 5,000 character limit? And this will be 10, 20 times that long. So I'm just going to upload it to my Google Drive with a link in the show notes. And anybody who's curious, please have a look. And by the way, these are not in order of preference. They're kind of random. We just picked 5. Another thing about the project that I thought was really fun, but maybe just because I'm childish, but I wouldn't tell Lindy anything about the story or the author or the novel or the author until after I had read it to her. And that was fun for me, the element of surprise. But what was that like for you, Lindy?
The novels, I was absolutely fine with that. But with the short stories, I felt like I needed the title. I didn't need to know the author, but often with a short story, the title is kind of part of the story itself.
Yeah, so I think about after 10 days, you made that request and I granted your request, gave you the titles and withheld the author's name until the end. And yeah, that was interesting. I would love to have somebody do that to me. So when the tables are turned and I fall and bump my head, Lindy, I would like the same treatment, just to see what it's like to experience fictional text without having that background. It's kind of like the page 112 thing, but on a much larger basis. So
I can imagine, Shawn, that would work especially well for you because you prefer to go into a book knowing as little as possible.
That's right. Exactly.
And I'm quite different in that I read reviews, I read the back stuff, the flaps, I read about the author. Like I try and get
She reads the synopsis on the back. Oh my God. She also files her taxes on time. What a strange person you are.
Yeah, that's me. But I find that all contributes to my enjoyment of it. Since I'm not interested in plot, there's almost nothing that's a spoiler for me.
Right.
I can perfectly enjoy a book knowing tons about it.
Lindy, would you like to talk about your first book or your first text?
So, as you said, when you get a sample of a longer piece, so you were reading from novels, it made me want to read the rest of the novel. And so my first book is one of those, and it is Home Waltz by Grisenthwaite. He's an Indigenous author from British Columbia, and the First Nation that he's from is Nukkamuk.
Very good. That sounds good to me.
Now, I have a question for you, Shawn. When you were reading from it, when there were words in that language, do you remember how you read them?
I just think I stumbled my way and did my best. I didn't remember that there was a lot in the opening.
So, for example, on the second sentence, it's easy to tell exactly what that word is because of the context.
Definitely.
It's a part of male anatomy that women don't have.
All right.
But the orthography for this language is such that it makes it hard to even figure out how to pronounce it. So this particular word, SPAEKS ? But some of the words have the L with a cross through it. There are lots of other odd symbols and upside down E's and that sort of thing. So whenever I came across one of those words, I didn't even try when I was reading this to pronounce it, but I couldn't remember what you had done.
I think I tried. So I said spakes, something. Yeah.
Right. Anyway, so just that beginning part sets up that the high school students are excited about a dance coming up and that there's going to be live music, a band that they like. And when you read it to me, I thought that it sounded like a young adult novel.
Whereas I was completely blown away by those opening chapters. So this is a very interesting way to start this discussion. Keep going.
I had already purchased the book. I hadn't started reading it when you read it to me. And since I already had the book, eventually when my eyesight was better, I read it. And my perspective really changed from that initial impression of, okay, it's a teen novel. I mean, it's fine. It wasn't. I got more and more and more excited about it. And the intense feeling of that main character who's the first person voice of this. I think he's 14 or 15 years old. And he is of mixed ethnicity. He's part white and part indigenous. And he's hanging out with a group of kids that aren't so nice to him. And it's all very raw. The language is just like the way that teenage boys speak, and that their main concern all the time is sex, and if they're going to get any. And their main occupation is drinking. So it's the kind of story that gives me an experience that I haven't lived myself, and I wouldn't be able to feel what it's like to be in that person without fiction like this. And I just loved this boy by the end of it. I just felt so much for the kind of situation that he was in, the poverty, the abuse at home, the alcoholism, everything. And I was just rooting for him, Yeah.
Now, and so there was a turn in your experience of the book, the more you read, and there was for me, because I started it within a week or 10 days after I had read it to you. And then I bailed because I thought, oh, Lindy was right. It's just YA. No. So, and I don't need to say any more than that, but yeah, given how you felt it really paid off to go all the way to the end, I may consider another try someday.
Yeah, I hope you will.
So yes, let me get to my first pick. And again, just to reiterate, these are not in order of preference. This is a novel from Estonia, Vargamäe, and it is part of a anthology, 5 volumes. And look at this, volume 1 is 540 pages by A.H. Tammsaare. I don't know how to pronounce his name, and I didn't take the time to look it up. But I read the first chapter of this to Lindy, and we both loved it. And this is one that I did have time to re-listen to my reading of it. And I still, look at nice end papers here. Probably an Estonian pattern of some sort. Translated from the Estonian by Ina Feldbach and Alan Peter Trei. And this comes out from a Glasgow publisher, Vagabond Voices, and I'm assuming they specialize in Baltic or even Estonian legend translation. So the opening chapter is about a newlywed, a peasant couple, both from farming backgrounds, and the husband is bringing his new bride home to the farm he has recently purchased, which is quite a ways away from her farm, but in those days, the end of the 19th century, that might have been 5 miles, I don't know, but by on a cart, and with the dowry cow, or cows, I think, she is seeing where she's going to spend possibly the rest of her life for the first time, and she's not very impressed. And there was something so, I don't know, earthy and vivid about that first chapter, because it culminates. The climax of chapter 1 is that one of the dowry cows, because it's so muddy, gets stuck in the mud, and so I don't think the men even take time to change out of their wedding clothes before they go and get the cow out of the mud.
I found it so atmospheric. Yes. I was just there in the cold mud and the rural quality of it. It reminded me of Kristen Lavren's daughter, I don't know if you've ever read that.
I've read the first volume, I think.
In that sense of being there.
Yes. Yeah. And both Lindy and I grew up on farms. So I really, and I didn't necessarily love growing up on a farm, but as I get older,
I did. I loved it.
As I get older, I really find myself gravitating towards farmer fiction. And I know that there's a lot of urbane and urban people out there that wouldn't read this because it was a farming novel, but I loved the atmosphere, as you said, Lindy. And even though it's a chunky bugger and I might need to read all 5 volumes, I can't wait to get to this. So that was fantastic.
The next one I'm going to talk about goes back even further in time, I think, because it's by that famous Georgian poet author. It goes by Vazha-Pshavela.
Right. And I didn't think to pull the little book, so I'll just put the GIF up here. But yes, that pronunciation sounds fine to me.
That's his pen name, and he was called Luka Razikashvili. Yeah. And he was born in the 19th century. And you read the entire little book to me.
That's right. I got wise as New Year's Eve was approaching that if I had a really teeny tiny book that was bound all together, but that I could read in 1 or 2 days to Lindy, then we could both add it to our Goodreads. So this is one of the ones that we added to our Goodreads.
Right. So it started out with a short story called The Death of Bagrat Zakharych. Yes.
Zakharych, I think, yeah.
And we both had similar literary references because it reminded us of Herman Melville, the scrivener. What was his name? Somebody.
Bartleby the Scrivener.
Bartleby the Scrivener. Okay. Yes, just in the way that the story is told, and because it's about a bureaucrat who died, and at the eulogy, the nice things that they had to say about him was like he knew all the punctuation. So it was funny, and it really tickled my fancy, I would say. Yeah, it was just kind of delightful. And so when I said, would you mind reading some of the other ones? Because I really like that. So
really, I'm enjoying listening to you talk about the story, and I have to admit that I don't remember anything about it. So it's one of the ones that just went gone. And I remember that I didn't enjoy the stories, and it ends with a long poem, and I was quite unimpressed overall with that collection, and you liked it quite a bit better, so that was good for you.
Yeah, well, again, it was the atmosphere. It was a very macho culture that he was writing about, all about the sword, living by the sword, and that little wife in her red dress at home.
That's right. Now it's coming back to me. Okay. The next one I have is a short story by the author of my top read of 2021. And I was actually just finishing up a reread of Tara June Winch's The Yield. And I did finish it just before New Year's. And I chose a story from her short story collection, After the Carnage. And I loved it so much. It's the title story. It has a little bit longer title of the story. It's called After the Carnage, More. After the Carnage, More. And that's the title story. This collection came out in 2016. And I think I'd heard fairly mixed reviews of this, but you and I both loved this story. And it's such a different story. It's about a man from Lahore. And he and his wife live in the West now, I believe in New York City area, but they're back in Lahore for a visit. And there's a terrorist attack as they are having an al fresco lunch in a cafe. And the present of the story is the man on a stretcher in the hospital corridor because there's no room for him anywhere else, asking about his wife and not getting a straight answer. So and all of his memories about his wife and living in Lahore and all this stuff. The structure was incredibly taut in a way that was quite different from the way that The Yield was structured. The story was very different, and it was gobsmackingly impressive. So, Tara June Winch, you go.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes.
Another one that I really liked was by a Canadian author, Shawn Virgo.
Shawn Virgo.
Short story called Mother Holly.
Well, you see, in the interim, I sent my copy of the collection this short story was published in, called White Lies and Other Stories by Shawn Virgo. I sent it to Canada because I'm moving there, and there is no GIF of the cover anywhere online. So I'm just going to put up a picture of the lovely Shawn Virgo's lovely face.
So it was set in a logging camp. And if I remember right, it was first person viewpoint or close third person viewpoint from someone who was a neophyte in this logging camp. And then there was a logger who had lots of experience. And the story boils down to respect and integrity. You know, how are you going to live your life? And it had such an impact. I thought the ending was fantastic.
I'm so glad that this is one of your choices because, yeah, Shawn Virgo, we had a friendly acquaintanceship back in the 90s. And so I have signed copies of all of his works. Certainly, it would be a stretch to say he's a friend. I have no idea where he is or what he's doing now. But he was the writer in residence. There was a title for they always had a novelist on staff teaching creative writing at the University of Saskatchewan. I don't think that was the title, writer in residence, but whatever that was, he was the guy at a certain time when I was there. And I had accumulated, I think, everything he's ever published. And then I tracked him down at the Harbourfront Festival years later. Don't think he remembered me at first, but we went out for tea and he signed all of my books, and that's the last I've ever. And I had brought some of them all the way to Tokyo. And finally, for the first time with Lindy, I read something he wrote. And I aborted. Yes. He is a Canadian writer of Maltese descent. And I should say also the collection title that you'll have seen the GIF all this time, but the collection of the short stories is White Lies and Other Fictions. And I aborted this story. Do you remember that?
Yes. So there's a lot of strong language.
Yeah, ethnic kind of stereotypes and stuff in the way that these lumberjacks, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Yeah, these lumberjacks are kind of bouncing off each other and stuff. And I was making me uncomfortable. And part of it was I thought that it would be uncomfortable for you. And I was getting uncomfortable. So I said, I can't finish reading this. And then you came back and said, oh, I actually think it was pretty realistic and it wasn't bothering you at all. So then I went back, reread, I read the rest of it, which was like 2/3 of it, to you the next day, and I completely agreed with you by the end. It was a very, very fine short story.
There is a thing about listening to strong language, hearing it out loud, that's different from when you read it on the page.
Absolutely. And also different reading it aloud, speaking it. That's what was making me uncomfortable.
These are the kind of words and epithets that you would never use.
Right.
Yeah, I was a cook in a construction camp for about 8 months. I heard that language all the time.
There's another video I'd like to see someday on Magpie Reads. This one, I don't have a lot to say about it other than how much I absolutely loved the writing. It was a book that came onto my radar from the Irish novelist, my reading buddy, Ronan Heschen. And that is this German novella, Old Rendering Plant by Wolfgang Hilbig, translated from the German by Isabel Fargo Cole. It's not all that obvious from the opening. I think I read you the first 7 pages. It's all one paragraph with spidery sentences that go from one page to the next often, what the story's about. But it's about a young man who, and his memories of being a young boy. As a young boy, he was obsessed with a decaying coal plant. And then by the time he's a young man, it has become a butchery. And there's a lot of stuff apparently embedded in the novel about historic horrors. But what we get in the first 7 pages is just a really stunning description of him going for a walk in this area. And I'm not sure now if it was when he was a young man or a young boy, but the sentences were just so gorgeous and they were just a joy to read. And that's all I can really say about it. I just thought the writing was stunning.
What the writing reminded me of was that German author. I'm going to have to look her up.
Oh, yeah.
Judith somebody. It's a black book with
Jenny
short
Erpenbeck, not Jenny Erpenbeck.
No, short stories that blend fiction and nonfiction. Each story starts with a photograph.
I'm searching for German writer Judith. Let's see what Schalansky.
Yes.
She's what her most recent one is. I have it on the shelf. On Red, an inventory of losses. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, interesting.
Inventory of losses. That's the one, Judith Schalansky. And there's one story in particular in there where she is walking through the countryside, and it's just that landscape description in very poetic, evocative terms. And that's what that reminded me of. Now, I only had to guess because you didn't tell me anything about it. I thought that it maybe was Scotland or
Wales, I think you said.
Or Wales, yeah.
Didn't know anything about Hilbig until we had that experience, and he sounds like a very interesting writer.
My next one is a book that's set in Senegal, No Heaven for Good Boys by Keisha Bush.
Oh, yes.
I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of that book, because in the opening, we've got a small group of boys, and they're fairly young. They're way too young to be out on their own, really. They've left their home village, and they're in a big city. I think they're in Dakar, and everything is new, and they have the opportunity to go to a zoo. I just wanted to hear more about it. I really like this story. Okay,
so I have quite a bit to say about this. So it's not a spoiler to say it's not obvious in that first chapter that I read you, but in the synopsis that they are part of this very sad, disgusting phenomena, Talibé, which is they were forced to beg on the street. And that was what they were doing, but we don't see that in the opening chapter. And it's by an African-American writer, Keisha Bush, who lived in Senegal for years and has written this novel. So very interesting. Subjectively, I was complaining to Lindy as I was reading it to her. I think I've been reading from a bunch of different books. This was the last one of the evening. And I was maybe starting to get into my cups with whatever it was, whatever alcoholic beverage I was drinking. And I started interrupting my own reading to complain to Lindy about how boring I thought this was. And then when I finished it, I said, I hated it. And it's the closest that Lindy and I ever came to blows during this reading project, because she loved it. And she didn't say, Shawn, what the hell is wrong with you? But it was kind of a diplomatic version of that at the ensuing discussion. So I always said, I will reread it another day. First I said, I will send the book to you because you couldn't pay me to read any more of this book. It's just so boring. And then I said, well, okay, I will reread it and see. And I didn't do that rereading until about 60 minutes ago. And I completely recant. I don't know what was wrong with me that night, but I don't know if I loved it, but I really, really liked it and feel that I do want to keep reading. I thought it was a very fine piece of writing, and it just didn't hit me right that particular night. And that is also a valuable thing that has come out of this experience, is that, we're all reading. I think it was the Canadian literary critic, Northrop Frye, who said, we're all reading, everybody's reading Milton with a hangover. So how we are in the world and what kind of a day we are having can affect our experience of a text. So I'm so glad that your very diplomatic scolding brought me back to give it another try, because I really liked it the second time. So,
good.
Second last pick for me is a short story by a writer I'd never heard of, Ruby Cowling, and the collection is This Paradise. It came out a year or two ago from Boiler House Press. It's a lovely physical book with really heavy paper and French flaps. The story that I read, Lindy, was maybe the very last day of the project, or the second last day. Was called Mating Week. And you love this one too. I didn't get a chance to do a thorough review of this. So my memory of it is that it is about a single female artist who is, maybe not too strong of a word to say, she's obsessed with Luna moths, and she makes art out of them, but isn't it out of their carcasses?
Yeah, they don't live very long.
They don't live very long, and she's the art that she's making isn't selling all that well. It isn't that popular with the market. Her art dealer's getting a little impatient with her.
Yeah, well, what she's drawing them, but what she's drawing is the pupae, like not the moths themselves.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And she's kind of at other than her art making is kind of at loose ends, and her sister, who is married with kids, is trying to set her up with this guy and that guy and this guy, and so she goes on yet another blind date at her sister's house. I may be misremembering. It may be her best friend's house, but
no, her sister. That's
sister's
right.
house. Yep. Mm-hmm. And meets this guy who seems like he might be better than average, and the story goes from there. But I just thought it was a profound meditation on being an artist, art making, and where art comes from and how it does or does not fit in with the rest of an artist's life. I have been so curious about this book, and it made me, at the risk of, stating the obvious, made me want to read the whole collection. So that was a memorable short story for me.
It was hard to narrow down 5, and I really wanted that one too.
Yes.
So my last one is by Jaime Cortez, and it's from the book Gordo. And it was the story called The Jesus Donut.
The opening story.
This is about a group of children in a migrant workers camp in California. And a donut truck, a bakery truck, comes along. And only one of the kids has any money to buy one donut. And so what ensues?
Right.
It was funny, but really tender and touching at the same time.
And I think it's gestured towards kind of adult themes of dislocation or, different economic issues. You get a picture of that through the eyes of the kids. Yeah, it was very memorable, and a really quite a nice pairing to the opening chapter of Heaven for Good Boys in some ways. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 2 books about children, which you said you normally don't like children as main characters, but
I don't like being trapped in a child narrator's mind. I need something, whether it's kind of looking back as an adult, and then it's usually okay, or something. Yet when I reread that opening chapter of No Heaven for Good Boys, I didn't have that experience at all. But a whole 400-page novel like that, it may start to wear me down. But yes, we had some very interesting discussions about all that, because a lot of these stories, as a lot of fiction in general, is about childhood and children. So that was fantastic. My last pick is, and I have a story about this, so I'm going to take an extra few minutes to set it up. When I was living in Vancouver, this was in the early 2000s, I believe. I found out about 2 days before it began that there was this big literary conference called AWP. And I always forget what it stands for, but now I'm quite sure, because I've looked it up a bazillion times, is the Association for Writing Professionals. And it's an absolutely humongous conference. I believe it's annual, and it's in different parts of North America, North America, I think. And so many writers are part of the programming. And it's like, I don't know, $600 for a pass or something like it. They're just exorbitantly expensive. But I found out 2 days beforehand that they needed volunteers. And if you were willing to do 5 hours or 4 hours of volunteering, you could get a free pass. So that day, Karen, if you're watching, sorry, all these years later, but I faked sick and did my 5 hours of volunteering at the ticket gate or whatever for the AWP conference. And then I had a free pass for the rest of it. And oh my God, the literary luminaries that were there. And one of the keynote speakers or authors was Ursula Le Guin. And at that time, I was not as much of a snob about genre fiction as I am now. In fact, I don't think I was at all. And I remembered reading her, her famous childhood novel, children's novel, middle grade novel, The Wizard of Earthsea. I had loved that as a kid and had never read anything else by her, but she was the keynote speaker. Speaker isn't the right word, but you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And she read a short story that by the end of it, and I'm not really good at listening to an author read their work. I mean, if it goes on and on, I often tune out and stuff. Maybe I've gotten better now that I'm a regular consumer of audiobooks, but I don't think I got the whole story, but I was deeply engaged and completely emotionally invested in it by the end. And that's the story this is my last pick, because I dug that up as an ebook. It's in a couple different collections, and the story is called Ether Or, not either or, but ether, as in what do you call it? The gas? Is that right? It's ether.
Ether, like in the air.
Yes.
Yeah.
So ether like that. And then or is capital O, capital R, organ. Ether Or is the title. Very clever title. And originally was published in her collection, Unlocking the Air. So you can get it there, or it's been also published in a collected works of her short fiction called The Unreal and the Real. So you can find it in either of those two places. It's not otherwise available for free online or anything. So I got the ebook, and I read Lindy, Ether Or, after all these years. So we're talking about 15 or more years ago that I heard it and was so blown away by it. I bought the book, got her to sign it, and I hope to hell I kept it, but I don't know where my copy of that book is after all these years and living in another continent or another part of the world. And I was absolutely blown away by it a second time, so much so that it chipped away a lot at my prejudice about speculative fiction or whatever, because it's in a way very realistic story, but it has elements of kind of a surreal or futuristic thing, in that the town of Ether, Oregon, is a town that keeps moving around in the continental United States. It just kind of shifts around like it's floating. And so that's the backdrop, but yet very realistic characters in this small town that each have their own first-person voice, and there is a cumulative emotional power to these voices of the villagers, of the people in this town, and then how they are affected by, or the fact that where they live isn't necessarily going to be tomorrow where it is today on the map. So that was one of the highlights for me of the project, was rereading that to you, loving it as much as I did all those years ago, and wanting to read now. Finally, many people will be happy that I do want to tippy-toe back into the works of Ursula Le Guin. So definite highlight.
Yeah. Oh, what a great author she is.
She was wonderful in person. And I remember telling her when she was signing my book that, and I meant it very sincerely at the time, that was one of the very best short stories I ever heard. So those are our 5 picks each. And like I say, the list of everything that I read to Lindy is going to be in the show notes as a Google Doc. And Lindy, any final thoughts?
Oh, I don't know what to say, Shawn. It was wonderful, and I will remember always that very special experience.
As will I, because like I say, I recommend it to anybody to do as a way of bonding with a reader friend, but also bonding with your own library of unread books, because I just loved it so much. Lindy, and I also should have said this at the beginning, but I'm certainly going to end on this note. Lindy has since, or in fact during this project, she launched her own BookTube channel. As she told you, it's Lindy's Magpie Reads, and she has just hit the ground running. I am her fairy godmother, BookTube fairy godmother, and I don't want to use the word proud, but that's the feeling that I have, and her channel is absolutely fantastic. So if you haven't checked out Lindy's channel, you absolutely must.
Well, thank you, Shawn. You gave me so much encouragement, and
I worked on you for several years, I think. So persistence, hey?
Yeah.
Lindy, darling, thank you so much.
Thank you, Shawn.